Mac Phipps was a rising star on Master P's No Limit Records, who some fans called the Nas of the South. But before Mac had a chance to go mainstream, he was found guilty of a murder he didn't do after cops threatened witnesses and made up lyrics in court. From blowing up as a rapper at 13 to spending over 20 years of his life behind bars, this is the wild story of Mac Phipps. Mac Phipps grew up in the Broadmoor neighborhood of uptown New Orleans, about 3 blocks from the Magnolia Projects. Before it was tore down, the Magnolia Projects were one of the wildest hoods in New Orleans. In the 90s, it had one of the highest murder rates in the country, but it was also the home to some of the most legendary rappers from New Orleans like Juvenile and Soulja Slim. Mac Phipps was one of 6 kids and grew up with both his parents. His dad was a Vietnam vet whose job was loading weapons during the war. According to Mac, they didn't have much growing up, but his parents always showed them love and encouraged him to pursue music. But they still struggled to get by, and from a young age, Mac wanted to find a way to move his family out the hood. Mac always loved music. He started writing songs when he was 7 years old and joined a group when he was 10. Even though Mac was from the South, he was inspired by all different kinds of music. He first fell in love with music after listening to New Edition, but as he got older and started rapping, he looked up to lyricists like Rakim. Mac and his group would perform at local talent shows and rap battles. Even at that age, Mac stood out and was offered a deal by Yo Records when he was only 12 years old. It was an unpaid deal, but they did put him in the studio with a future legend, Mannie Fresh. Mannie Fresh was still an unknown producer at the time and helped Mac work on writing verses and delivering his rhymes. Along with Gregory D, Mannie Fresh produced all of Mac's first album. The Lyrical Midget came out in 1990, when Mac was only 13. At the time, he was rapping under the name Lil Mac. Lil Mac was early in the new wave of New Orleans hip-hop that was about to take over the world. In the late 80s and early 90s, Southern hip-hop had a pretty small fan base compared to today. Most of the big rappers were based in New York or California, and the South didn't have much influence. The Lyrical Midget was one of the first albums to come out of New Orleans and show off a whole new sound. The song I Need Wheels was a local hit and put Lil Mac on the map. Even at 13, Mac was already using metaphors and storytelling, which attracted fans of lyrical hip-hop. Most New Orleans hip-hop at the time was more influenced by gangster rap and bounce music, so Lil Mac was like a breath of fresh air and offered fans something different. Over the next few years, Lil Mac continued to work on his talents. In high school, he joined a group called Psycho Ward, which was a huge collective made up of 28 different rappers. They were influenced by the Wu-Tang Clan, and each rapper brought a different style and personality to the group. They released one album in 1997 called www.psychoward.com. But even out of 28 different rappers, Mac still stood out as the most talented, so he eventually left the group to focus on a solo career. He got an offer from Def Jam Records to move out to New York and sign with them, but Mac turned it down and decided to stay local, signing a deal with Master P's No Limit Records instead. Master P grew up in the Calio Projects, another neighborhood in uptown New Orleans, not far from where Mac Phipps grew up in Broadmoor. Master P founded No Limit Records in 1995 and signed his brothers C Murder and Silk the Shocker. By 97, No Limit was taken off after releasing back-to-back hit albums. Along with Mac Phipps, the label also signed Mystical, Snoop Dogg, and Soulja Slim that same year. So, signing with No Limit proved to be a great move for Mac's career. Mac Phipps changed his name from Lil Mac to just Mac and started touring all over the US and Europe. Mac also started doing features for other No Limit artists and showed up on Master P's album Ghetto D, Mystical's project Unpredictable, and Mia X's project Unladylike. Signing to No Limit was also the first time Mac ever got paid for making music. He was finally able to move his family out of New Orleans. The Phipps family moved to a nice area in Baton Rouge where some of the other No Limit artists lived, so it seemed like Mac had finally made out of the struggle and had a bright career ahead of him. In 98, Mac released his first solo album, Shell Shock, with features from Master P, Soulja Slim, C Murder, and more. The album was a big success and made it to number 11 on the Billboard chart. It was also a huge hit with fans and critics, and some even say it's the best album No Limit ever put out. Shell Shock had the perfect balance of lyrical tracks, dirty South bangers, and smooth cuts that made it stand out from the other No Limit albums. Mac's lyrical ability was undeniable, and that's when fans started calling him Nas of the South. Mac kept the momentum pushing and continued to do features for other No Limit artists while working on his second album. But by 99, No Limit started going through some changes. Most of the members from their main production team, Beats by the Pound, had just left the label over money issues. Cash Money Records was also starting to take off and created more competition for No Limit in the industry. Mac dropped his second album, World War III, in September of 99. Many fans thought it was the best No Limit release that year, but it was a commercial flop compared to Shell Shock and peaked at number 44 on the Billboard chart. It didn't feature any production from the whole Beats by the Pound crew and didn't have as many features either. Mac's core fanbase still liked the album, but it didn't have the same feel as a classic No Limit project, and many casual fans felt Mac was more like an East Coast MC than a Southern rapper. Master P tried to revive No Limit in 2000 by forming the 504 Boys. Named after the New Orleans zip code, the 504 Boys was a supergroup made up of Master P, C Murder, Mystical, Silk the Shocker, Mac, and more. They released an album called Goodfellas in 2000, which was a massive hit and made it to #1 on Billboard. Mac also wrote a verse and a hook for the album's hit single, Wobble Wobble. Wobble Wobble ended up being one of No Limit's biggest hits and proved they still had a huge fan base, so it seemed like things were turning around. But Mac still wasn't happy about the failure of World War III and wanted to get out of his deal. Mac Phipps wanted to start his own independent label and hire his close friends and family to help him run it. His parents and siblings were already helping him manage his career and run the business, so Mac wanted to make it official by going independent and hiring them as his team. But before he got the chance, Mac was involved in a crazy situation that put him behind bars for the next 20 years. On February 20th, 2000, Mac had a show at Club Mercedes in Slidell, Louisiana, a city outside of New Orleans. Mac didn't really want to perform that night. It was a small, rundown club in a bad area. Mac had just done a bunch of shows in Mississippi and was also getting ready for another tour. So Mac took a nap and considered bailing on the show, but his dad woke him up and convinced him to go. Mac didn't want to disappoint his fans, so he decided to get ready and drive out to Slidell. Years later, his dad said that convincing Mac to go to Club Mercedes that night was one of the biggest regrets of his life. Mac's whole family was there for the show. His mom was working the door, while his dad and brother Chad were also there to make sure everything went according to plan. No one had any idea it would be Mac's last concert for a long time. During the show, a fight broke out on the dance floor. A gunshot went off, and everyone started running toward the exit. But rather than run away, Mac stayed behind to look for his mom. Mac was strapped, so he pulled out his own gun to protect himself. Even though he never fired the gun, witnesses saw him holding it and pointing it at the ceiling.
I pulled my gun out when I ran toward the door, and that was probably the biggest mistake I ever made. I would later learn that because people saw me with this gun, that's kind of why people were like under the belief that maybe he did it.
That was enough to make some people think he was the one shooting. At first, it didn't seem that serious. Mac found his mom, made sure she was safe, then went home with his crew. But Mac's dad stayed behind to see what happened. That's when he saw a 19-year-old named Baron Victor Jr. lying on the ground bleeding. Baron had been shot in the arm, and a nursing student who was in the crowd was treating him. The nurse told Mac's dad that Baron would be fine and the injury wasn't that serious. So Mac's dad left the club, thinking that Baron would be taken to the hospital and everything would be fine. He drove back to Baton Rouge and got ready for bed. But before he could lay down, he saw 3 cops with guns drawn running up to the house. When Mac's dad went outside to see what was going on, the cops told him to get on his knees. They demanded to see Mac because he was wanted for the shooting. Mac went with him to the police station. At the time, he was more worried about catching a gun charge than a murder case. Mac didn't even know that the dude who'd been shot at the club was dead. Mac knew he didn't do anything, so he thought the victim would eventually wake up and tell the cops who really shot him. But Mac was carrying a concealed weapon without a license. So before even speaking to a lawyer, Mac lied and said that he didn't have a gun that night. That was a huge mistake for Mac because the cops then told Mac that Baron died from the gunshot wound after the bullet traveled from his arm to his chest and killed him. Suddenly, Mac realized he was being investigated for murder, but Mac knew he was innocent and thought he could prove it. So Mac decided to come clean and admitted to the cops he had a gun that night but never fired it. Mac even offered to bring the cops back to his house where he stashed the gun so they could see it hadn't been fired and didn't match the bullet that killed Baron. Police did agree to go search the house, but it didn't work out the way Mac had hoped. With Mac in handcuffs, police searched the Phipps family home in Baton Rouge and found the gun. Just like Mac had said, it was still fully loaded and hadn't been fired. But that wasn't enough to convince the police that Mac was innocent. The cops came up with the story that Mac had a second gun that he fired and got rid of. Now he was trying to throw him off by planting the unfired gun. They tore apart the whole house looking for the murder weapon. Even though they didn't find anything, they still brought Mac back to the jail and charged him with murder. Mac Phipps spent the next few years locked up fighting the case. During that time, there were rumors in Broadmoor that someone in the neighborhood was bragging about the murder police were pinning on Mac. Mac's dad heard that a family friend named Thomas Williams was telling everyone that he was the one who killed Baron that night at Club Mercedes. Thomas was engaged to Mac's aunt and also had 2 kids with her. On the night of the murder, he was at the club working as security for Mac. One day, Mac's dad decided to confront Thomas Williams inside of a gas station and pressured him to tell police what really happened. Thomas knew he was wrong, but said he was scared of going to jail. But eventually, his conscience got to him, and Thomas went to the police station to confess the murder. In a videotaped confession, Thomas said he saw Barron run toward him with a beer bottle, so he panicked and pulled out his gun. Then he shot Barron in self-defense.
I was just standing there, I was panicking. I reached and I fired. Because I was so nervous, I didn't know what else to do. I was protecting myself.
He added that Mac wasn't even with him at the time and had nothing to do with the murder. Mac's family was hopeful that the confession would be enough to prove he was innocent, but the cops had a different story. The police dismissed the confession and said that Thomas was nothing more than a loyal worker who was willing to take the fall for his famous boss. So police never charged Thomas with the murder and didn't even search his house for the murder weapon. 6 months later, Thomas was arrested on unrelated weapons charges, but police never even tried to find out if any of the guns were used in the murder of Barron Victor Jr. In their minds, the police already had the killer locked up and didn't want to hear any other explanation. Mac wasn't just a local artist. He was a huge celebrity and famous gangster rapper with hit records. No Limit was famous for flexing their wealth and flashy lifestyles, so the local cops and politicians hated them. Plus, Mac didn't get locked up in New Orleans. He got arrested in Tammany Parish, an area that has a reputation for racism. The Tammany Parish DA, Walter Reed, was famous for pressuring police to harass black people and do whatever they had to do to make arrests. Years later, Walter Reed was found guilty of fraud and corruption, but at the time, he was the one building the case against Mac. So no matter what evidence came out, the cops refused to listen. They were convinced that Mac was guilty and used shady tactics to convince a jury. During his trial, prosecutors used Mac's rap career to paint him as a cold-blooded killer who glorified violence in his music. They brought up his nickname, the Camouflage Assassin, and even quoted some of his songs like "Murder, Murder, Kill, Kill, You F with me, you get a bullet in your brain." But it turns out they misquoted the lyrics on purpose. The lawyers took bars from two completely different songs to make Mac seem as violent and aggressive as possible. Even though he had no criminal record, they made him seem like a monster. They also questioned Thomas Williams' confession. Thomas claimed that he shot Barron from about 6 to 10 feet away, but the prosecutors said that evidence shows that Barron was shot at close range. Thomas was never called to testify, and he was even charged with obstruction of justice because his statements didn't match the coroner's report. Even though the DA was using dirty tactics, Mac and his family still had hope that Mac could be found innocent. Mac had one of the best lawyers in New Orleans, and so many facts in the case didn't add up. The witnesses all told a different story about what happened, and the police never even found a murder weapon. There was no hard evidence tying Mac to the murder other than a few people seeing him pull out his gun. But when the verdict came back, it shocked Mac and his family. The jury voted 10-2 to find him guilty of manslaughter. Louisiana was one of the few states that allowed a guilty verdict in a criminal trial without votes from all the jurors. So Mac was found guilty and sentenced to 30 years in prison. The night he was sentenced, Mac cried himself to sleep. But even though things were looking rough, Mac and his family never gave up hope that one day he'd get out. Mac Thibbs spent time at a few different prisons, including Elaine Hunt, Wynn Correctional Center, and Angola. The entire time he was locked up, he never got in trouble or written up once. He spent most of his time teaching other inmates about music and mentoring younger prisoners with anger and depression. He even joined a music crew at Elaine Hunt and taught himself how to play piano and bass. But when he wasn't making music, Mac was also in the library studying law. He spent years looking at his case file, trying to find enough evidence to win an appeal. It took some years, but in 2014, he finally caught a break. A group called the Medill Justice Project at LSU started looking into his case. They published an investigation that had evidence proving Mac was innocent. They found out some of the witnesses' stories contradicted each other. Mac's friend and manager, Russell Baker, also told the police that he was with Mac when the shots went off, but he was never called to the stand. In 2015, the Huffington Post also did their own investigation and found even more evidence. The victim's cousin, Nathaniel Tillotson, said they looked Mac dead in the eye as he shot Barron. But the Huffington Post found a statement from another witness named Jerry Price, who told the police that Nathaniel was outside the club when the shooting happened. Yulon James, the nursing student who helped Barron while he was bleeding out, also testified that she saw sparks coming from Mac's gun. But she later took back her statement and told the Huffington Post that she only testified because the cops had threatened her. 4 other witnesses also came forward and admitted they'd been pressured by the police to lie and say Mac was the killer. Mac's family thought all that would be enough to get him out of prison, but the DA shut it down and said there wasn't enough new evidence to reopen the case. Even though it was disappointing, Mac continued to fight. Finally, in 2020, Mac's story was featured on the Louder Than Riot podcast. That brought more attention to the case and gave Mac new hope of getting out. Finally, in May 2021, John Bel Edwards, the governor of Louisiana, approved Mac's appeal, and he was released on parole in June after spending 21 years locked up. Mac still makes music, but these days he's more focused on his family and enjoying his new freedom. Mac got married in 2018 in the yard at Elaine Hunt. His best man was C. Murder. his label mate at No Limit, who's also serving time for a murder. Most people who spent over 20 years in prison for something they didn't do would probably come out pretty angry, but Mac used it as motivation to be a positive role model in the community. He still mentors kids to prevent them from going down a path that could land them in prison. He also drops an album called Son of the City and joined the rest of No Limit on a reunion tour. So, even though he'll never get those 21 years back, at least Mac got a second chance at life and picked up right where he left off with his music career.